Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, and I want to welcome you to season 4 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Together with expert guests and those with lived experiences, we will give you some tools to empower you to live a life of good health and happiness. It's a great pleasure today to be speaking to my friend Professor Jacky Boivin about trying to conceive. Just relax, the truth about stress and fertility. Jacky is Professor of Health Psychology at Cardiff University and Director of Women's Health Research Wales. Trying to conceive can be one of life's most emotionally challenging experiences, as I know too well, as it took me 7 years to have my family. Yet many people are still told that if only they relax, pregnancy will happen. I certainly had that said to me many times. So in this episode, myself and Jacky separate myth from evidence. We explore the real relationship between stress and fertility, the psychological impact of going through fertility treatment, the role of counselling and peer support, and how couples can navigate difficult decisions together during fertility treatment. Welcome, Jacky.
Hi, Joyce. How are you?
Good. Always good to see you, Jacky. Let's start with telling us about your career and what led you to focus on the psychology of fertility and trying to conceive.
So, originally, I wanted to be a medical doctor. That's what I wanted to be, but I couldn't stomach the anatomy. I just couldn't deal with it. So, I thought what I'd rather do then is something that's got biology in it, but no anatomy. So, I did psychobiology, and that eventually led me to reproductive health, fertility, and those sorts of topics, and eventually became over time an expert in women's health.
You very much are an expert, and I'm really looking forward to digging deeper into some of these. Now, we have had in this mini series conversations around fertility testing, around lifestyle, what it's like to go through fertility treatment, juggling our time at work, all these sorts of things. And as you know, I've been through fertility treatment as well. And the common phrase that many of us on this journey sometimes hear, or all too often actually, is just relax and it will happen, which I personally feel is a bit unhelpful. But what's your view on just relax, it will happen?
So, I mean, it's so common to hear patients tell us that somebody said, just relax and you'll get pregnant. So I think that's really unhelpful. And I think it's unhelpful for several reasons. One, it blames the woman usually because it's usually directed to women. Relax, stop thinking about it, and you'll get pregnant. And of course, that means that something in her or her not relaxing or stressing out around her fertility is actually causing the infertility. So I think that kind of blaming is just not helpful. The other thing is that the implication of it is that if you relax, somehow your fertility will be restored. So the implication is that it's stress itself that's causing the infertility when there's not really any evidence for stress having that kind of direct biological role where you relax and somehow your blocked tubes open up or your ovaries start working regularly. It just doesn't work like that. Fertility doesn't work like that.
So let's split into two scenarios. If we're trying to conceive naturally, or couples who are going through IVF and other assisted reproduction, what does the research actually tell us about these two scenarios with regarding to stress, distress, and outcomes?
Uh, okay. So I think that the reason people, well, first of all, to start, a lot of people think that stress affects fertility. So stress causes infertility, stress causes miscarriage, stress causes all kinds of things related to reproduction. And I think that comes from research that's mainly been done on non human animals where they can randomize little mice, for example, to a stress condition and a not stress condition. And if you put animals in those conditions, then litter sizes are smaller than they would otherwise be. But of course, humans are kind of slightly different animals. That's the first thing to say. And I think that um, if you're trying to conceive naturally, it's true that you have interactions between the biology of the stress response and the biology of reproduction, because we know that from this kind of non-human animal research that I'm talking about. So there is capacity there for those two to interact. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that if it's a bad time, there's scarce resources or there are lots of predators around, that you wouldn't be focusing on reproduction. You'd be focusing on fighting off the predators or finding resources. But what people always forget is that we have very selfish genes, as you know, and they want to reproduce. And reproduction is one of the most important aspects of um, of of our genetic makeup, if you will. So eventually, we also have mechanisms that suppress this link between stress and fertility, because it's never a good idea to not reproduce at all. And so, in the context of natural reproduction, either we habituate to the stress around us, and people will say that they get used to the stress at work, for example, or our stress system stops responding to the stressors in its environment, or our fertility compensates for the influence of stress hormones on the reproductive axis, because it's there to reproduce. In the context of medical treatment, it's even less likely that stress would have an effect, because if you think of the treatments that we have, the fertility drugs, they're there to almost overstimulate the reproductive axis. And so the stress would have to be absolutely enormous in order for it to, say, counterbalance ovarian stimulation, to actually prevent ovarian stimulation from producing follicles. And of course, if you just look in a broader world context, some of the countries that have the worst poverty, the most scarce resources, are also the countries that have the highest fertility rates. So it just it's a concept, and it's possible in highly, a controlled non-human animal research settings, but it's not something that causes long-term infertility in people as a direct effect. There are indirect effects, but
Can we just take one step back? So what is stress and what's it actually doing to our body? You mentioned some of the hormones there. So what are the stress hormones? What's going on when our body is stressed?
so imagine this is the way, depending on what theories you use, but this is probably the most common theory of stress. So first of all, an event is in your environment, and you perceive that environment. You ask yourself the question, is this a threat to my well-being? And when you perceive a threat, it gets transduced internally from the brain, and it activates different parts of your body, right? So you can have a fast acting reaction that causes sweaty palms and racing heart and so on. And it can have a slower response through the release of cortisol stress hormones, for example. Uh, so that's what happens in terms of the physiology of when you perceive that threat. But cognitively, you then ask yourself the question, do I have the resources to manage that threat? And the management of the threat is things like your coping resources. Can I problem solve myself out of this situation? Do I have social support? Do I have financial resources? These are all your coping resources. So those stress reactions, the physiology, or things like feeling tense or insomnia, or all these other stress reactions, they occur when the threat is really high and your resources are really low. That's the greater likelihood of stress effects. But most people can manage the stress that's around them in their environment because they have enough coping resources. And we see it in fertility clients, for example. Uh, why is it the case that there's not 100% of people that go do counseling? It's because most people can feel they can cope with their own resources, with the family and friends support, with clinic support, and so on. It takes a long time for people to feel that they don't have the resources to manage. And then they go, okay, I can't do this on my own. I'm going to see the counselor. And that's the coping resource that brings these two things into balance. And so stress reactions can happen, but the extent of stress reaction you would need to shut down the reproductive system would be enormous. It's not likely to be your typical stress that the typical average couple faces when they undergo fertility treatment.
And you mentioned cortisol, so that's probably the hormone that many people have heard about. Um, so so cortisol goes up when we're stressed. Have there been studies that have measured cortisol in different groups of people who were trying to get pregnant to see if there was any differences?
Yeah, there are studies that look at stress hormones, but they're kind of imperfect studies in a way because the fact that the stress hormones goes up doesn't necessarily mean that it has a knock-on effect on something else. So, for example, there are studies that have looked at salivary cortisol, for example, or hair cortisol, or the manifestation of cortisol in hair samples, which is slightly more chronic stressors. And you can have these can be elevated, but that doesn't mean that the axis that produces that stress hormone depresses the reproductive system. It could be elevated and not have an effect at all on the uh, axis that regulates reproduction, or that axis that regulates reproduction may be under the control of fertility drugs, in which case, even if you had high levels of cortisol, it wouldn't have an effect, right? So it's that kind of balance that's often not properly examined in the context of humans.
And what about when we relax? So when we relax, what are the important hormones there, and what is relaxing doing to cortisol?
Well, I think that people will see that there may be differences in hormonal response, but the better effect of relaxing is the effects that it has in a more behavioral sense of what we're doing that might interfere. So when we're stressed, it's not just the inside of the body that may be responding, it's also what we're doing in terms of behavior. So, for example, when people are really stressed, they might have sex less often, and that's going to have a direct effect on fertility. Or they might be overeating or undereating. That's going to have an effect. And as you know, these are clearly well demonstrated effects. Or you might over exercise and really get into marathon running and so on, and that affects your reproductive system. And we see this all the time, that when people are stressed, they stop treatment, they stop fertility treatment. And we have, even in places like Belgium, where they have 6 free cycles, 25% of people drop out after the first unsuccessful cycle, and it's that percentage is about 55% after the second unsuccessful cycle. And this is despite the treatment being free and people having still a good prognosis to achieve parenthood. So because the stress of treatment is too great for them, they drop out. And of course, if they're not doing the treatment, they're not going to be able to get pregnant. So it's not just the internal changes we have to think about, it's the behavioral changes that stress causes.
Yeah, and that's important what you said there, because Another common saying that I've heard if a couple are trying to get pregnant, not getting pregnant, is, "Oh, just go through IVF." And we've already
Mm,
discussed on this podcast in the last few episodes, just going through IVF is another crazy statement. Having been through it myself, it was a very, very hard procedure to go through. It was not easy. And
yeah.
certainly I had stress when I was trying to get pregnant because every time you get another period, um, you obviously became very sad. So it really does have an effect on your mental health. But going through fertility treatment is a very stressful procedure. And the study I did years ago asking people that were past reproductive age but had wanted children and didn't have children, those that had been through IVF, it was that emotional reasons why they stopped IVF. It's not financial. As you said, in some countries it's paid for, but it's just very, very hard to go through IVF. So is there anything that we should be advising couples about? As you said, it's the sort of more social side, having less sex, eating, overeating, and things like that. So whether they're trying to get pregnant naturally or going through IVF, are there ways that they can try to regulate themselves so they're not becoming super stressed by the situation that they're in?
Such an important question, and thanks for your kind of reflections there. I mean, there are many points in the fertility treatment that are extremely difficult for people. Even starting on the journey is really difficult. And it's difficult if you're doing it on your own. It's difficult if you're doing it as a couple, because sometimes people say, oh, for couples, it's easy. They can support each other. So there are many points along the way where there'll be a lot of stress and anxiety. I guess the thing to consider is this balance that I was talking about earlier. So first of all, obviously, when you imagine being under treatment, it's a threatening situation. There are many unknowns for people. And we know that having a lot of uncertainty is a very stressful, can act as a stressor in itself. So the first thing that I think needs to happen is not actually from the couples. I think it's from the clinics. Many clinics don't really inform people of the reality of fertility treatment. And I think people are poorly prepared for what undergoing fertility treatment entails. There's a kind of norm within the service providers that to go cycle by cycle. So you talk about here, you're going to be doing a cycle of treatment, and then we'll see what happens. But the reality is that for a lot of people, they'll need multiple cycles to achieve a pregnancy. And for a lot of people, they'll do them and not achieve pregnancy at the end of it. And if people were better prepared for those, then they could better manage those demands. And in our kind of multi-cycle planning approach, what this really means is being prepared, first of all, for the fact that it's likely to take multiple cycles. Two, that people give you the opportunity to think about the challenges that might arise, whether financial challenges, relationship strain, the physical demands of treatment, like you said, the worrying about whether this treatment cycle is going to work. All of those are known challenges. They're not secrets in IVF. We all know what the challenges are. And when you ask couples, well, what would you do if you had a financial challenge? What would you do if you had relationship challenges? They can readily come up with solutions, right? So what we need to do is prepare couples for the possibility those might arise so that they can have a kind of IVF plan, imagine what the challenges might be, and prepare for them in advance rather than be in the middle of a super stressful interaction in a couple and have to think of what the solutions might be so they're not so stressed out or they're not so conflicted with each other. And the clinics can do that. We have lists, they could just put them on a waiting table somewhere in the clinic. The other thing that stresses people out is these protocol changes where you your treatment doesn't work, and Joyce, you have written so much about this. The treatment cycle doesn't work. The couple wants something different, and they immediately go to all kinds of add-ons that could, and they think they could improve their success rates. But in reality, we could tell in advance the couples that there likely be protocol changes or not, right? If the cycle doesn't work, we're not going to do anything. Or if the cycle doesn't work, we might adjust your drugs and ad- tell people in advance all the possible, not all, but the main protocol changes. Like you might have to use exterior, or you might have to have more drugs, or so people can anticipate them in advance and think of decisions, what decisions they would make if they were faced with that. I mean, we do it with birth plans. We should have IVF plans as well. And I think that would help people to prepare for their IVF cycles. I've probably gone on a little bit too much on that, but it's a lot. IVF is a lot about preparation and putting your resources, you see the threat and putting your resources up front. So when the threat happens, you're ready. You know what to grab to help yourself through the situation.
Yeah, and IVF add-ons has come up in all of the episodes of this miniseries, and the next podcast is going to be with Sarah Lenson, who's been doing some brilliant work down in
Yeah,
Australia,
great.
and we're the whole episode is going to be about IVF add-ons. So we'll
Yeah,
go.
I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, and it is such an emotional roller coaster, and a lot of people that have in relation to add-ons, they found it very stressful when they've been maybe partway through their treatment. Hannah Vaughan Jones, who I had on this podcast in one of the first episodes I ever did 4 years ago, has been through a lot of fertility treatment, and she said that there was one day she was literally they were had just had her eggs collected, and then the clinic came up with, oh, there's all these add-ons that we think you should do. And she's like so emotionally stressed already. And then
Yeah,
they're adding this
yeah.
totally inopportune moment. That is not the time to have this conversation around,
No, exactly.
it's crazy. And you also mentioned counselling. Now in the UK, I don't know what the situation in other countries. In the UK, I believe every patient is offered a counsellor, and I don't think that many of them take it up because I think we have this thing in our head that if you're seeing a counselor, there's something wrong. But having been through fertility treatment and those that listened to the last episode with Becky Kearns and the stress of going through this and trying to juggle your work, I started crying again because so many emotions came up from when I was going through fertility treatment. And I think counseling really should be encouraged. It gives the patients a platform with someone who's really experienced in dealing with any emotional issues that could come up. To It's a space for you to talk about it and to unload how you're feeling around going through this treatment. What do you think, Jackie?
Um, yeah, I think that these big life events, people can always benefit from having discussions about the life event to find a way to process it and integrate it with the rest of their life story. How do you make sense of something like this? Um, but at the same time, you have to balance it with what people want to have. And the research shows that when you make counseling mandatory, people don't benefit from it. It benefits when counseling is targeted at risk groups, for example, that already have vulnerabilities because of past trauma, for example, or vulnerabilities uh, because of past episodes of depression or other mental health conditions, or they have a history of recurrent miscarriage, and it just wears them down after 4, 5, 6 miscarriages, right? And you just feel like you need to have those discussions. Um, but for a lot of people, this will not be their first point of entry. The majority of people don't use counseling. So What do we do with those people? Do we just say, sorry, we can't, if it's the counselor or nothing? And that's why we've certainly encouraged uh, fertility staff to train to be able to provide patient-centered care so that everybody gets something and the staff are more prepared to support people psychologically. And more recently, we've been doing also things like workshops on sharing bad news or expectation management with staff, because otherwise all those people that don't see counselors wouldn't get anything. So it's a balance there.
So you mentioned about bad news. So the bad news that can happen in so many stages for anyone going through fertility treatment. So obviously, first is finding out that you may not be able to respond well to the fertility drugs, or you have an egg collection, but maybe you don't get many eggs, or you don't get many embryos, or you don't have many embryos to transfer, or any to freeze. And then you've got the 2-week wait for your pregnancy test. And then for a small group of people, that will be successful, but for the majority of people, it will not be successful. And people I know get so concerned when they haven't got pregnant, even though we know the data. We know the data in the UK for the youngest group, so the under 35s, is still only about 33% chance of getting pregnant in any one cycle. So you mentioned that we talked about counselling. You've mentioned training the staff in the clinic. Is there anything else that couples going through this could do? I know some clinics are employing psychologists to help and give support. Is there any way that couples can help or find help with this emotional roller coaster that they're embarking on?
Yeah. I think you forgot also two other points that we see in research, which are really high stress points when there is a cycle cancellation, early cancellation, because as you say, there's no eggs or no sperm or no fertilization. That stress level is the same as the stress level if you get to the point of a pregnancy test and it's negative. Also spotting during the second week of the waiting period, that's extremely stressful that you get, like, high peaks there. And, of course, when you get pregnant, it's not rose, garden. It's still massively stressful for people, and most people who get pregnant, of course, they can experience a miscarriage, but even if the pregnancy continues, it's experienced like a high-risk pregnancy, and it's got a lot of high stress there. In terms of strategies, well, there's no inherently good or bad coping strategy, but the situation can make it so. So the thing to do is to think of the coping resources that will help people. So, for example, the kind of strategies that might work during the 2-week stimulation phase might be effective there, like problem solving, making appointments, being organized, trying to get a lot of information, etc. But using problem solving to try to control the stressor would be completely useless and probably harmful if you were using it during the 2-week waiting period, because the outcome is uncontrollable and unpredictable. So trying to control that situation would just result in more frustration and angst, right? In those situations, you're better to use things like distraction or relaxation or changing your way of seeing the situation, like being more positive. Not positive as in happy-go-lucky positive, but every negative situation has possibilities for you to focus on some positive aspect of it or positive aspect of the outdoors to give yourself a little bit of psychological break from the negativity of the situation. So kind of knowing which strategies are better in the different phases of the cycle can be quite useful. I think if you're talking, because you mentioned couples specifically, I think then for couples, what you really need to focus on is the fact that you have two individuals undergoing the same event. And so the perceptions of threat and the perceptions of resources are times 2, right? Uh, and sometimes women say, "Oh, their partner doesn't care because they don't feel like the threat of it, or they're not as stressed out about it." Or one partner likes to cope in a completely opposite way to the other partner, and it causes relational strain. So being clear at the beginning and having honest conversations about how you see the situation and what kind of coping resources you think you're going to use. If one really wants to talk to everybody about it and the other one really doesn't, it's going to cause all kinds of massive stress, right? But if you talk about that in advance, then you could probably find a match there. Let's just talk to our closest friends about it or something like this, right? The other thing is that there are many decision points in fertility treatment. So you mentioned some things like you have to decide, are we going to have treatment? Right? If you're having trouble conceiving, that's one big decision, and you may have different viewpoints about that. Or should we switch now to using donor eggs? Massive decision. How much money do we want to put into doing this treatment? All of those are potential, high stress decision moments, and they're being really good at decision making as a couple is gonna be useful. So, lining up your options, what the pros and cons of each of them are, and then valuing which of the things are the pros you really, really wanna have and the cons that you really, really wanna avoid, and deliberating amongst yourselves about these things, doing it in a kind of structured way, also, I think is really going to be important. And lastly, I think you just also need to step out of the whole fertility thing sometimes and just go out and do activities that take you out of that as
Right, you've,
well.
you've you've brought up a lot there. So obviously there are people that go through this treatment on their own. But if we let's
Yeah,
talk about the couple more. You've brought up so many different issues there, and one is that they are two very different people, and so many people are yin and yang with their partner. So
yeah,
I was definitely with my partner. I wanted to tell everybody. He didn't want to tell anybody. um,
yeah,
so I absolutely relate to that. So that as you suggested, those conversations are important to have as soon as you can, and you can only have those with each other. Are you going to tell anybody? Are you going to tell family or
uh,
friends? Where do you draw the line? And we did a Women's Hour podcast about this a few months ago, about how everyone's going to be different. Some people will want to tell, for example, work. We discussed that in the last podcast with Becky Kearns. Some people want to tell their employers. Some people will not want to tell their employers. Um, there's an obvious thing if you're someone that normally drinks alcohol and you're out with friends and then you're not drinking
yeah,
alcohol, they will start putting two and two together. So there's so much just on the day to day discussions around that. But then, as you said,
yeah,
the decisions around the fertility treatment, there's a point if it's not working, there's a point where one of you or both of you will decide that enough is enough, or we do go down this next treatment, or we don't go down the next. Those are really, really key decisions. And as you've said, I think having those conversations before, and if you have everything on the table, as you suggested earlier, and knowing what all the possibilities of treatment are right at the beginning, then as a couple, you can sit in your own comfort of your own home and discuss where you might draw the line. And this probably will change as you go through it. I know people that went through one IVF cycle and said, I can't do that again. And then our dear friend
yeah,
Jessica, 11 rounds of IVF.
yeah,
Hannah Vaughan Jones, I think she was on her 15th embryo transfer when she then got pregnant. Everyone's got their own tolerance to how much of this, because it is so emotional, about how much they can go through.
yeah.
So do you think one of the key things is those conversations with whoever's going on this journey with you, understanding that you're different people and trying to talk as much as possible and not blame each other and all those sorts of things, but sit and discuss as openly as you can rather than just let things sort of snowball?
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. It has to be open, and it has to be in a cooperative spirit, to have those discussions, so you're not, like, going into the conversation wanting to compel the person to do the thing that you would like, the option that you would like. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is that, we're really all very good at gathering information, but we're not necessarily very good at deliberating on that information. Um, so there are some cognitive heuristics and biases that humans have. Like, we look for information that just confirms what we think. So we bring to the table only the information that just says the same thing as we want, right? And so when you're having discussions, you're just always armed with your side of the argument, and the other one's there with their side of the argument, and then you can't find the middle ground. So I think what's important there is that you gather your information and then you lay out the options. We could do this, we could do that, we could do the other thing, A, B, C, D. And the first thing you do is, what are the things that are completely non-options for us, that are not acceptable? Because then you can already agree on something, and that makes you think, okay, we can reach a common consensus. We would never use donor eggs or donor sperm, for example. You could, like, rule something out, and you've already feel like you've done something together, and then go through all the different ones and lay out for each one of you what are the pros and cons. I mean, I'm making it sound like it's a very systematic process, but obviously it's very much more natural when you're actually doing it. But those things are the things that are really important, and always, as you say, in the spirit of open communication and trying to get to a point of collaboration and consensus, really.
And their views might change. I know people that have changed their minds
Yeah.
about donor conception, for example, so they might
Oh,
change.
yeah, absolutely. Very common, very common. That and adoption.
Yeah.
People start off absolutely no, never, and then the desire for parenthood is what comes at the surface, and other options become, acceptable.
Do you think finding other people who are going through what you're going through, we'll all have a different experience, but are there patient support groups that would be useful if they didn't want to talk to the clinic or didn't want to talk to the counselor or a psychologist? Who else could they get some support from?
I think the peer groups are really important. People get a lot out of that. Chat rooms, forums, Reddit groups, wherever you can get people that have similar experiences. I have a lot of discussions about that with our patient and public involvement group here at the center. So, on the one hand, these things are really good because they often validate the experiences that you have in a way that other people who aren't going through the same thing as you are can do. I think you also can get information, but from the perspective of the user. Like, someone can give you information about a medication, but someone who's had it and has had tremendous breast pain as a result of it can tell you more about what that breast pain is like, for example. So there's a lot of information there that's really useful. But and this is the point of discussion with these PPI groups that I've just mentioned, or advocacy groups. They can also have, like, a negative influence. So sometimes people use forums because they're not satisfied with the healthcare they get, and they can be quite negative in the groups about the healthcare experiences, and that can actually put other people off seeking care. And we've been talking about that in the context of some research we're doing about dysmenorrhea, and people are so dissatisfied with the way dysmenorrhea or severe period pain is managed that all the other people, including their own daughters, for example, or get put off and don't go and seek medical attention. So there is that kind of alternative side to them as well, and it's kind of difficult to know what to do about that because on the one hand, the forms are really useful or that pathway is really useful, but you can't really tell them, don't talk about negative things because that's one of the things they enjoy about going, not enjoy, but that is positive about going to the group. So it's a tricky one, that one.
Yeah, and another thing that worries me is if they get some advice that's not the same or doesn't agree with the advice they would have got from their clinician. So, for example, maybe
Yeah.
using an add-on or, "Oh, it worked for me," "This treatment that costs £3,000, oh, it worked for me," and then people might be led to think, "Oh, it might work for them," but understanding that we're all very different, so please don't ever take any medical advice from anybody, which leads me into
No, I
social.
absolutely agree.
Yeah, and that leads me into social media. So what are we seeing
Mm.
out there in social media with regards to the emotional side of fertility treatment? Is it do you know if it's good or is it harmful?
I think it's what we've been talking about now. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how psychology works sometimes, and we get um, these opportunistic um, commercial interests here that can come in. Um, for example, of the genre relax and you'll get pregnant,
Yeah.
but the relax is through some, um, womb massage, for
Oh God.
example, or some other way that's going to help you to relax um, and probably for people they don't need to spend that amount of money to relax, number 1, and number 2, it's not gonna get them pregnant, so it's like false advertising. It might change their quality of life, but it's not gonna get them pregnant, which is, the lure that's in these, posts oftentimes. And I remember a conversation I had in a not a conversation I had, a conversation I overheard in a fertility clinic. This was years ago, a clinic on Harley Street in London. And I was waiting to see the director, and I overheard these 2 patients talking that didn't know each other. And one patient said, I've just done reflexology and I got pregnant. It's the most amazing thing. And she's describing this. And I could clearly see that this person was in her 50s and she probably had donor eggs. And I thought to myself, the reason you're pregnant is because of the donor eggs. But in her mind, she had done reflexology at the time of embryo transfer, and that's what got her pregnant. That was her causal explanation for why she got pregnant. And I just thought that was, like, remarkable to kind of imagine that. And, of course, the other patient was listening and going, "Yeah, oh, maybe I'll do that. Yeah, where did you go?" And they were exchanging information. So the social media is a little bit like that when it comes to psychology. It's opportunistic, I would say, sometimes.
Yeah, there's a number of us that are very adamant that we should be following evidence-based medicine, and this absolutely relates to fertility treatment. And there is so much. I mean, the IVF add-ons are almost all non-evidence based, and some of them now are ingrained in IVF clinics, and they cost thousands. And some of them have been around for 30 years, that we'll talk about in the next podcast. And there's no evidence still that they work, but people are doing it, and that breaks my heart. I think they're so vulnerable and they
Yeah.
will do anything they can.
Yeah, but, I there's something very interesting there. I 100% agree with you on that. But there's something interesting that we've discovered in our research, which is patients do not like to repeat the same cycle.
Mm.
They really don't, because they think to themselves, why would the cycle get me pregnant when it didn't last time? They like a change. They like something to be different. And I think the add-ons, let's put aside all the commercial interests and all that kind of stuff. I think that it fulfills that need for them to have something different that gives them the feeling that they have a chance at pregnancy again. Whereas if they just repeated the cycle, they would have the same chance in a way, right? The add-on is ineffective, so you might as well just repeat the same thing. It would have exactly the same effect, but it serves a psychological function there, I think.
Yeah, with the success rate, as I said, it's only about 33% for the younger group. So if you're older than that, your chances are even less. And we've got so much data on this from authorities like the HFEA that govern fertility treatment in the UK. If it was me, when it was me going through, I didn't change things. If you're looking at the evidence, you just need to repeat it. It's not 70
Exactly.
it's not 76% chance of getting pregnant, 76% chance of not getting pregnant. So you shouldn't keep changing things. That to me, we're both systematic people, so we would just want to do the same thing, and maybe after 3 or 4 goes, then change something. But that leads us nicely, Jackie, into education. So you and I have worked together on fertility education and the need to help people understand about trying to get pregnant naturally, but also trying to get pregnant through fertility treatment. So, from your research, what are the main things that people don't know besides the fact that they should just not keep changing their IVF cycle? What other things do people not know about their fertility from your work?
Um, I I uh, I think that this I remember I used to do the fertility show, give talks there on stress and fertility, and I had said to the organizers, "I'll do those talks, but they have to be first thing in the morning." Because then when people are going up and down the stalls, they're gonna see the things that aren't going to help them, and they're not gonna be lured into it. So I think having an understanding of the relationship between psychology and fertility, I think would be really useful, especially stress and fertility, because I think that lures people into a lot of different corners. Uh, and I think for me, of course, I would like to have better education on the reality of fertility treatments, as I've described earlier in this podcast, that it's multiple cycles, the possible challenges, the possible protocol changes. So people can start these fertility treatments and make informed decisions thinking about all those things, but also planning potentially for those things. So for me, that would certainly be something that those 2 things, if we could do those 2 things, I think we'd be well ahead. But of course, yeah, I think those 2 things, I'm gonna stick to that.
Yeah. Going back to the very first question about just relax and you'll get pregnant. So we've discussed that just relax is and reducing your stress is not going to improve your chance of getting pregnant, but it is important for your mental health. But as you said, when they
Yeah.
go around these shows and things, there is and they listen to social media, there are so many harebrained things, actually things that are offered by the clinic. There are so many things that are really not going to help. But they're but for their own emotional resilience and trying to get through their fertility experience or journey. I know some people don't like journey, but um,
Mm.
I think looking after your mental health, your own mental health. So for me, just even outside the fertility sphere, just trying to get women to look after their own mental health because of the crazy lives that we're living. I think relaxing is really important, but you don't need to put some strange magnet in your vagina or or go in and
Stare at a red
oh
dot.
yeah, I'm trying to think of all the crazy things that this wellness is just in 2 branches now. There's all the back to basics which do sensible things like go for a walk in nature and read a book and walk on the grass or whatever. And then there's all this crazy stuff, which is all the money making stuff about vitamin infusions into your bloodstream and hyperbolic chambers and uh, precious suits. draining your lymphatic system and all these crazy things. And certainly my advice for anyone trying to get pregnant is yes, relax, but relax for your own well-being and your own mental health, because it is a difficult journey that you're on. But you don't have to do any of these crazy things. If you're listening to a crazy thing on social media, I would try and scroll over it, swipe the other way so you don't
Yeah.
have to, because I just think it's
Yeah.
insane. What do you think about all these crazy,
Yeah.
crazy new ways of trying to relax?
So I think, again, they serve a psychological function. So I think that fertility and infertility are highly unpredictable, uncontrollable events, but that have immense personal significance. And I think that when people are choosing things like this, they're trying to restore a sense of control. And this follows very well-established psychological, um, ways that people have to overcome tragic life events. So when tragic life events happen to you, the first thing you need to go, "Why me?" That's the question people "Why did this happen to me?" And people have to find a way to integrate this with how, it fits and it sits in their own life story. Second, people try to restore control. Sometimes, when people have infertility, they go out and they go, like, on a whole diet thing, and they eat all kinds of broccoli or, fertility vitamins and so on. It's not so much the vitamins they're after, it's the restoring the sense of control that they can have over this very, very unpredictable life event. And I think the third thing that people try to do is restore their sense of feeling good. I mean, these things will knock you off your socks. They really, really are difficult, and people will try to do things to restore their well-being. And I think there are things like you're talking about, like relaxation or really good things are going to be the things that help people. And people know what are the things, spending time with family and friends, doing artwork, whatever it is, right? The thing you want to avoid is the thing in the middle, because that restoring control in an uncontrollable and unpredictable situation is just gonna not help you, and that's what leads to add-ons and leads to buying little red circles that you stare at or all kinds of getting into hyperbolic chambers and what have you, you know? So, you have to think, you have to be able to differentiate those things, I think. But it's part of adaptation to tragic life events.
It is a tragic life event. I was going to mention the word grief earlier, and we were talking about stages. If you don't have a transfer, if you have a negative pregnancy test, have a miscarriage, it is obviously a huge grief event. And the why me? Oh my goodness! I had years of saying
Yeah,
why me, why me.
yeah,
Yeah, that's very hard.
yeah.
And the fertility supplements, we have done a number of research projects recently on fertility supplements, and they will be coming out soon and be published, and I will talk more about them then. But Jackie, this leads us very nicely to the last questions, which I ask all my guests. So my first is, what makes you happy, Jackie, and where is your happy place?
I thought about this. I thought, "Oh, great question." So my happy place is being outdoors. And when I was a kid, up until I was about 15, from the last weekend in May to the first weekend in September, on the Friday and for the entire weekend, we would go on my dad's land. And there were 4 or 5 families, and the cars, you can imagine these old cars back in the '70s and stuff would open, the doors would open, and 4 or 5 kids would drop out of it, and then you would play in the countryside. Cars were decanted is the way that I can think of it, and you just roam the countryside. And that's always stayed with me. And if ever I have stressful events or something, I always, imagine that area and the being outdoors. And now, it doesn't matter what the outdoor is now, the festival, the allotment, the sitting in the garden, taking a walk in the park. It always feels it gives me that sense of freedom, and it gives me that just the sense of wonder of nature, really. So that's my happy place, and if I can twin that with, a loved one, even better.
Fabulous. And the very last question, Jackie, what advice would you give your younger self?
The first thing I thought was, "Don't go out with idiots." That was the first thing I thought. Then I
I've had
thought
that before.
I thought you probably wanted some, like, career advice.
Not necessarily. In my book, there was a lot of choose your partners more wisely. Yeah, and I'd agree with that one.
Yeah, yeah, so, yeah, that's mine. Don't go out with idiots, but no, seriously, in terms of career, I was very fortunate, I was one of those, um, young people. I came from a poor background, and, I didn't have the kind of advantage to compete. I could get all great school grades and everything, but once you get to graduate school and you have to take entrance exams and everything, it was very difficult to compete, especially since I was second language. My first language is French. Um, and I do remember at that time, at some point thinking, oh, I just can't do it, and fortunately for me, my mother said, "Well, you can't fall at the first obstacle. You gotta keep going, right?" But if I could go back to myself then, I would reassure myself that, you know, it just might take more time, but to keep your sense of self in terms of that, and your knowledge of your capacities and being able to work through those challenges as we've been talking about. If I'd been prepared for them, I would have been said, "Oh yeah, okay, I know what this is."
Well, we're very lucky that you did persevere, and your contribution to fertility psychology, and education has been immense. It's always great working with you and spending time with you, Jackie. And thank you so much for sharing your
Thanks.
great wisdom on this podcast today. Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Joyce. As always, you're always full of life. Love it. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.